the question that emerges in these short verses is simply this: how can churches and Christians thrive when the great big world has all the power, and when simply believing in Jesus and living for him seems risky? That's the question. How can Christians thrive when simply believing in Jesus feels dangerous? Thriving seems like a bit much to ask. In my current level of personal challenge, surviving seems like enough. And maybe you're there too, or you've had moments like that where it's like, I'm in this moment, I'm facing a challenge, survive in advance seems like it would be good enough. But Jesus suggests that in times of challenge, thriving is possible. We saw this in chapter 1, and so I'll just remind us briefly that Jesus, through John, tells us, beginning in verse 3, "Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written in it, for the time is near." And blessed, that churchy kind of word means truly happy, but in a God-centered kind of way. And as we've looked at it, when we encounter it in the psalm or when we encounter it in this passage, we understand that being truly happy results from knowing and trusting and worshiping, reverencing, fearing the true God, knowing the true God's forgiveness, living in the true God's world as he made it according to his instructions. And so this is a God-informed, God-centered happiness which Jesus is saying can belong to the church even in times of challenge. And somehow, Jesus expects that Christians facing pressure for simply being Christian can thrive. And we know that because that's the challenge that is facing the church in Smyrna. Now, you can visit Smyrna today. It's the third largest city in Greece. Turkey. If you're a poli-sci major, I just made a faux pas. In Turkey. And its name is Izmir. It's a mere 17-and-a-half-hour flight from Columbus. It's a seaport city, gateway into what people in Jesus' day called Asia, and that will be important. We'll come back to that in a moment. Smyrna claimed to be the home city of the man who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, Homer. Remember him? That's why you didn't get a 4.0 your freshman year in college, is because you were assigned the Odyssey. And, just being biographical there. And Smyrna was an ancient city in Jesus' day, 700 years before Jesus. So twice or more the lifetime of our country, Smyrna had been destroyed. And then 300 years before Jesus, so about the lifetime of our country, Smyrna had been rebuilt. This was an ancient city. And they had a story of challenge and of rebirth in their civic history. But now the Smyrnian Christians were facing an existential challenge. That being a Christian was proving to be beyond risky, that their existence was threatened. And it is true that some of our Christian family in the world, even today, wake up facing the same challenge, that there is an existential risk for being a Christian. Now, today, that may not be our challenge. We're here safely in this building. We're not expecting anything particularly risky to happen. We have a team that works at our security behind the scenes. We're not concerned that we'll be rounded up before the end of the sermon. You might be concerned about when the end of the sermon will be, but we're generally safe. And yet, to contextualize the challenge, if at work or at school or maybe even in your family, if you feel nervous for being known as a Christian or for being outed as a Christian, if you worry that your friends' awareness that you believe in Jesus and are seeking to live for him might get you canceled, if you haven't had the how important is following Jesus to you question with your boyfriend or girlfriend because you're worried that you're in a different place and that might bring your relationship to a close, then you're actually not far away from the challenge that the Smyrna Christians faced. That simple faith in Jesus was producing real challenges in their life. And the real challenge emerges in Jesus' introduction to the Christians, and it's important that we get this correct. So look at verse 8. To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, the words of the first and the last, who died and came to life. I know your tribulations and your poverty, but you are rich. And the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Now, let's just stop right there, because in our world, in a moment where anti-Semitism is a real risk, it's important to think carefully about what Jesus is saying here when he describes the slander of those who say they are Jews but are not. It's important to put this in its historical context. That Romans viewed Christianity, this new thing of Christianity, a couple decades old, they viewed it as a subset of the Jewish religion for obvious reasons. It was emerging from Judea, that the first adherents to it were Jewish. Judaism was in the Roman Empire, at least at that point, a protected religion, and by that, what it was meant is that they were allowed to worship their God in their way. They did not have to worship the emperor or engage in the pagan cults. But as time went on, the Romans wised up that the Christian message was different than the Jewish message. And so Christians lost their association with Judaism and the protection that went with it. So apparently in Smyrna, Jews were outing Christians to the authorities. And outing Christians to the authorities solidified their place in the city. So Jesus' words, they say that they are Jews but are not, indicate several things. First of all, it indicates that these people thought that they were doing the right thing. And it's interesting, Jesus describes this in John's Gospel in chapter 16 to the apostles, where he says, they will put you out of the synagogues. Indeed, the hour is coming when whoever kills you will think he's offering service to God. And so this was being experienced. And the second lesson from this is that membership in God's family is not about ethnicity. It's not about heritage. It's about faith in Jesus. That membership in God's family is Messiah-centered, Christ-centered, if you will, and is regardless of background. Jesus, Jewish by birth. The first apostles, Jewish by birth. These people in Smyrna, many of them not Jewish by birth. But let me be as clear as I can that Jesus identifies this as a first century Smyrna problem. So we cannot, as Christians, and I wouldn't expect that we would, but we want to be clear, that we cannot nurture animosity towards our Jewish friends or neighbors as a result of this passage, or as a result of any passage. Jesus is not here telling his disciples to retaliate. Jesus' word to Christians is about how to respond faithfully for ourselves, and we need to know, and our Jewish neighbors and friends need to know, given episodes of Christian anti-Semitism in history, that there's not any warrant for anti-Semitism here. Just as there isn't warrant for racism or sexism or the other ways that people divide one from another in a fallen world. The problem is the outing. That's the problem. The pressure, the tribulation, the real loss for being Christian. So how should Christians respond to this kind of challenge? Well, I think three lessons emerge in these verses. First, lean into the stunning greatness of Christ. Evaluate your wealth accurately, and then prize the right rescue. So first, when faith leads to big challenges like this outing for being a Christian, lean into the stunning greatness of Christ. So I learned something about the magnitude of the Smyrnans' challenge this week that I didn't see before, and it's in verse 10. Do not fear what you are about to suffer, Jesus says. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. What I learned was that in the first century world, imprisonment was not a primary form of punishment. People were imprisoned, but being imprisoned was a stop along the way to something worse happening. Not so much in our world, where if you're convicted of a crime, you might be sentenced to imprisonment. You might be sentenced to a prison term. In the first century world, you were put into prison to be coerced, to change your view or your action or your behavior, or you were detained pending trial, you were arrested pending execution. So unlike today where you could be imprisoned and that would be the penalty, the Smyrnans would have known that imprisonment was a step on the way to something worse. Execution, probably. Simply for being Christian. And identified as such to the authorities. So how does Jesus encourage the Christians? In the letters to the 7 churches, Jesus introduces himself to each church with a reference to the vision in chapter 1 that we looked at several weeks ago. Each church hears from Jesus something about Jesus that's relevant to the problem that they're facing. And so we pay attention to how Jesus introduces himself to the church because that's the part of him, so to speak, that he wants the church to know. And don't you find that to be true in your own life as a Christian? That Jesus is incomprehensibly great. That we cannot ultimately fathom his glory, but when we face challenges, there are aspects to who he is that meet us where we are. That we might be going through a time where we're emotionally fragile and we need to know that he is the one who doesn't break the bruised reed. Or we might be going through a time where we feel alone and we need to know that he is our good shepherd who is with us. We've had the experience of learning that there is part of Jesus that maps onto the need that we have. And that's what is happening here for the Smyrna Christians. Jesus says to these people who are about to experience arrest unto a capital trial, the words of the first and the last, who died and came to life. And Jesus is picking up for them what he says in verse 8 of chapter 1, where he says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, who is and who was and who is to come, the Almighty. Or in verse 17 of chapter 1, fear not, I am the first and the last and the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and Hades. And what Jesus is doing there is he is applying to himself how God describes himself through Isaiah in the Old Testament in chapter 44 and verse 6. Thus says Yahweh, the King of Israel and his Redeemer, Yahweh of hosts, I am the first and I am the last. Besides me, there is no God. In other words, to this troubled people who are wondering if they are coming to the end of their story very quickly, Jesus introduces himself to them on the basis of his eternality. Now, eternal is another churchy word, but we should pause and reflect on what eternal means with respect to God in order to understand why Jesus chooses this to tell these beleaguered Christians. So I dug through a couple of theology books, and here's what Wayne Grudem first defines eternality this way. God has no beginning, end, or succession of moments of time in his own being. He sees all time equally vividly, yet he sees events in time and acts in time. No beginning, no end, no yesterday, no today, no tomorrow. He is. J.I. Packer applies it this way. God does not have it in him to go out of existence. He continues forever unchanged. God does not need to be sustained or maintained. He's not maturing in his competencies. He's not worn out by a universe of problems. God doesn't change. Kim and I were watching a TV show last night. It was series, and the episode that we watched ended in a cliffhanger. And we looked at each other and we said, do we have it in us to watch another episode? And we looked at the clock and it was 8:45. So we went to bed. God doesn't wear out. He doesn't change. He's not tired. Jesus says, that's me. I'm the eternal one. I am the first and the last. I was there before the beginning. I'll be there after the end. And as great as that theology point is, if you're a Smyrnan Christian and you're wondering if you're coming to the end of your life for being a Christian, wouldn't you want to know that someone's going to be there after the end? Wouldn't you want to know, because there's so much that we don't know about what happens after the end, that the person who is there after the end is the person who was there from before the beginning? And that the person who was there from before the beginning and the person who will be there after the end is the person who loves you so very, very much. Well, how do you know he loves you so very much? Well, because of the second way he introduces himself. He died and he came to life. Jesus is encouraging the Christians to lean into his stunning greatness. He's not only eternal, but he has passed through death to life. And he is, and this is to us mind-bending, and it has challenged the theologians across 2,000 years to figure out exactly how we can articulate in human words that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, is both eternal and died. That he is from before the beginning and he is without end and he's passed through death and is alive again. And I'm actually not going to try to crack that code for you this morning, because I think part of the glory is to ponder the mystery. Because as you ponder the mystery, your heart goes in the direction of how deep the love of Jesus must be for his people. Here is all the gospel. That God, the eternal Son, took to himself a human nature, took to himself changeability. The God who can't change took to himself changeability in his human nature so that he could die, so that he would die, in order to save us who must die because of sin and consequence. And yet, because this Son is sinless, his death did not end in death. His death ended in life. And if you're new to Christianity and you're just thinking about Jesus, really, that's all you need to know at this point, is that the Son of God, out of great love for you, died for you and then rose for you. So that if you place your faith in him, you find forgiveness for the sin that otherwise you will be held accountable for, and that I would otherwise be held accountable for. This is what Jesus tells the Smyrnans. This is how you can thrive. But there's more. When faith leads to big challenges, you can evaluate your wealth accurately. Jesus says a curious thing in verse 9. I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich. Jesus knows the believers are facing big challenges. One of the challenges that they're facing is poverty. We don't know the exact reason for the poverty. It could be that the gospel is gaining traction, particularly among the lower economic classes of the Roman world. And we know that most of the Roman world was enslaved. It could be that these earliest churches were from predominantly slave and lower income classes, and that they just were basically living life of poverty. That could be one explanation. And it could also be that as the gospel was becoming more clear to people, and as Christian conduct was becoming more distinct in its culture, as Christian conduct will become more distinct in our culture, that just for living as Christians, for not engaging in the pagan rites that were intersecting with the economic system of the day, that they were finding themselves increasingly on the economic margins. So it might be that they'd had hard jobs economically. It might be that they had wealth and were coming into poverty for being Christians. We don't know exactly why. We know that Jesus knows the struggle. But the weird thing that he says, at least it sounds weird to me, is when he says, "But you are rich." Now, no one's ever asked me to be a Bible translator. They shouldn't ask me to be a Bible translator. But if I could be a Bible translator for one moment, I would take the "but you are rich" out of parentheses here. Because in the language of the New Testament, it's actually strong. And in our world, parentheses can make it sound a little bit side-eyed, a little bit, I know about your poverty, but you're rich. Like he's saying it under his breath. He's not. The Greek language, and you can ask Chris about this later, is strong. See, you throw the theology questions at me for the new member class. They're going to ask you the Greek questions. But the tribulation and poverty, but to the contrary, it's strongly adversative. But to the contrary, or but rather you are rich. So when faith in Jesus leads to big challenges, Jesus says, evaluate your wealth differently. Now, mentioning that Smyrna was in Asia was more than just a geography note for the next time you play Bible trivia. It is to allow me to be able to say now that some years earlier, the Apostle Peter wrote a letter to the churches in Asia. We call it 1 Peter, and we can't prove that Smyrna got the letter of 1 Peter, but Smyrna was a leading city in the region. And so it's hard to imagine that they wouldn't have got a copy of 1 Peter. And Peter starts his letter this way. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you've been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him, and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. What if we've gotten our spiritual economy all wrong? Well, what do you mean? Well, I mean this, but I say this to me as well as to you. What if we measure the value of our faith in terms of how well we think life is going? What if we think that the economy of believing Jesus is up, the market is up on good days, and the economy of believing Jesus is off on bad days? What if what Jesus is saying to the Smyrna Christians and what Peter was saying to the Christians in the same region of the world in Asia is this, that the economy of faith proves its value when life stinks? That the economy of faith proves how valuable it is when imprisonment is looming. Why? Genuine faith means that you get what you think you will lose when you're canceled, when you're outed, or worse. Genuine faith results in praise, glory, and honor. Around the world, across time, in places where believers have faced real harm for faith in Jesus, in the moments when Christians were actually martyred, the wealth of faith produced joy inexpressible filled with glory because it goes somewhere. It produces what it promises, the salvation of your souls. Loved ones, this is your wealth. This is your wealth. This is my wealth. When big problems come, when real challenges exist, Jesus says, evaluate your wealth accurately, and then you'll see what's really at risk. And when you evaluate your wealth accurately and the challenge comes, it says, well, if you're known for being a Christian, I'm not going to like you anymore. And you say, well, big deal. Because the value of my faith tells me who values me. So, well, if you are known for being a Christian, you can't hang around with us anymore. You say, well, big deal. Because apparently we're not going to be hanging around together very long anyway, because I know where I'm going. Well, if you're known for being a Christian, then I don't have place for you in my life. That's okay. I know someone who gave his life for me so that I could have a place in his life. Evaluate your wealth differently. And then thirdly, prioritize the right reward. Verse 10, for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. It's interesting, this expression, 10 days of tribulation. I think there are a couple of lessons in here. First, I think it reminds us that times of challenges are time-bound. Jesus is eternal. Challenges are not. I am the first and the last. 10 days of tribulation. So being faithful unto death leads to the crown of life, which is eternal life. In other words, entering into the same kind of ongoing life that Jesus says he already possesses. But I think that there's another lesson to learn from the 10 days of tribulation. And this I'm learning from other commentators, but it rings true to me. And that is that because, oftentimes the symbolism of Revelation builds on the Old Testament. We saw that a couple weeks ago. That what is symbolized in Revelation needs to be interpreted by the Old Testament, not by like some secret esoteric code. It's very interesting to contemplate that Daniel and his 3 friends were tested for 10 days. Let me remind you of the story. Please don't think about the vegetable cartoon characters while I read this. Now you're thinking about the vegetable cartoon characters. This is a helpful connection because in the allusion to Daniel, we see that Daniel's prioritizing the right reward. Let me set the stage. If the story of Daniel is new to you, in the Old Testament, Daniel and others are carried into captivity by King Nebuchadnezzar to Babylon, and King Nebuchadnezzar has set up kind of an assimilation training program for smart young Jewish boys. And the smart young Jewish boys can go into Nebuchadnezzar's training program, and if they do well, they can work for Nebuchadnezzar in his pagan court. And they would be selected to train for him. So we pick up the story in Daniel 1 and verse 8. So Daniel and his friends are in this training program, but Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. In other words, to not worship the religious idols of Nebuchadnezzar, which is exactly the same challenge that the Smyrna Christians are facing hundreds of years later. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him to not defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you are in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of those youths who eat the king's food be observed by you. And deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. Hey, Daniel, worship the idol. No, I'm going to prioritize the right reward. I'm not going to bow down to your thing. I'm going to follow during this period of testing, come what may. Because you don't know at the beginning of the testing what's going to happen at the end of the testing, right? I mean, Daniel doesn't know that the vegetarian plan is going to work out. He just knows that he has to follow and not bow down to the idols and trust God with the right reward, which is exactly what Jesus is saying to the Smyrnans. Trouble's coming, 10 days, time-bound, not long compared to eternity, but if you're faithful, eternity on the other side for you. But also remember Daniel, that God's in control and that he is achieving the purposes through your trial that he intends. Daniel puts his future on the line by prioritizing faithfulness. He has his eye on the right king, the Lord, not Nebuchadnezzar. Jesus tells the Smyrnans, keep your eyes on the right king, the first and the last, the defeater of death. So we need to keep our eyes on the right king. Keeping our eye on the right king puts the first and second death into perspective. The Smyrnans need to hear this because their freedom, their income, their security, their lives are all at risk. But these are all first death problems. First death comes for all people, whether peacefully or through tribulation. But second death does not come for all people. Second death comes for unbelievers. But for believers, no second death. Because second death is what Jesus conquered by his first death. And just over in Revelation 5, as the vision continues, one of the elders says to John, weep no more. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David has conquered, so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals. And between the throne and the 4 living creatures and among the elders, I saw a lamb standing, as though it had been slain, with the 7 horns and the 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. In other words, I saw a lamb that had moved through first death, had conquered first death, for whom there was no second death, either for him or for those who are in him. So to the church in Smyrna and to the church across the world and around the ages, and to us should challenges like this come. Jesus says, prioritize the right reward. Keep your eye on not the problems of the first death, but of the freedom from the second death.